December 1, 1943. The cold morning air over Emden, Germany, carried with it something new. Something the Luftwaffe had not yet learned to fear, but soon would. As the formation of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses droned eastward through the steel-gray European sky, their crews scanning nervously for the inevitable swarm of German fighters, a different silhouette cut through the clouds beside them. Sleek, purposeful, with the distinctive profile of a shark nosing through deep water. The P-51 Mustang had arrived over Germany for the first time as a long-range escort fighter. The men in those bombers didn't know it yet, but the aircraft flying alongside them would change everything. Just weeks earlier, such protection this deep into German territory would have been unthinkable. The combined American and British strategic bombing campaign hung by a thread, bleeding crews and aircraft at a rate that threatened to end the entire offensive before it could achieve its objectives. The optimistic pre-war doctrine that the bomber will always get through had been shattered over the skies of Germany, shredded by Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters that tore through bomber formations with devastating efficiency. The men who climbed into their B-17s and B-24s each morning knew the brutal mathematics. On some missions, 1 in 4 bombers never came home. The crisis had reached its terrible peak just 6 weeks before, on October 14, 1943, a day the men of the 8th Air Force would forever remember as Black Thursday. 291 B-17 flying fortresses had lifted off from English airfields that morning, bound for Schweinfurt deep in the heart of Germany, targeting the ball-bearing factories that produced vital components for nearly every piece of German war machinery. The planners had learned painful lessons from an earlier raid on Schweinfurt in August, when the force had been split between 2 targets and losses had been catastrophic. This time, they concentrated the entire striking force on Schweinfurt alone. They added every fighter escort they could muster, P-47 Thunderbolts that could accompany the bombers partway into Germany before their limited fuel forced them to turn back. The crews were told the changes would make the difference. They were wrong. The Luftwaffe was waiting. As the P-47 escorts reached their range limit and peeled away, leaving the bombers to continue alone into the depths of German airspace, the fighter attacks began. Wave after wave of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s dove into the formations, their cannons and machine guns raking the heavy bombers. The gunners in the B-17s fought back desperately, filling the air with tracer fire, but the German fighters pressed home their attacks with savage determination. Some German pilots, their ammunition exhausted, even attempted to ram the bombers, such was their commitment to stopping the raid. When the survivors limped back to England that evening, the losses were almost beyond comprehension. 60 B-17s had been shot down, blown apart over Germany or crippled so badly they crashed attempting to reach the coast. Another 17 landed so damaged they could never fly again, reduced to scrap metal and spare parts. 121 more bore battle damage in varying degrees. Shattered glass, torn metal, hydraulic fluid and blood coating the fuselages. Of the 2,900 men who had taken off that morning, 650 would never return, killed in action, captured, or fallen into the cold North Sea. The losses represented 26% of the attacking force. In some bomb groups, the casualty rates climbed even higher. The American official history would later acknowledge what everyone knew immediately. The 8th Air Force had, for the time being, lost air superiority over Germany. Deep strikes into Germany were suspended. The bomber crews who had survived Black Thursday and the other terrible missions of that October knew they could not continue much longer at such losses. In Washington and London, military planners confronted an uncomfortable truth. Without a solution to the fighter problem, the entire strategic bombing campaign might have to be abandoned. Years of planning, billions of dollars in resources, factories churning out bombers by the thousands. All of it meaningless if the bombers couldn't survive long enough to strike their targets. What the combined bomber offensive desperately needed was a fighter that could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back, a fighter that could match or exceed the performance of the Luftwaffe's best, a fighter that could turn the hunters into the hunted. The irony was that such an aircraft already existed. Even as those bombers burned over Schweinfurt, the solution was already in production, already beginning to arrive in England. But the story of how that aircraft came to be was almost as unlikely as its eventual impact on the war. It was a story that began 3 years earlier, an ocean away, in a moment of wartime desperation and American audacity. April 1940. Britain stood nearly alone in Europe. Poland had fallen, France was falling, and the Luftwaffe was preparing to turn its full fury against the British Isles. The Royal Air Force, which would soon be fighting for Britain's very survival in the skies over southern England, faced a stark numbers problem. They simply did not have enough aircraft to meet their needs, and British factories, even running at maximum capacity, could not produce fighters fast enough. The British Purchasing Commission, dispatched to the United States to acquire war material before America's entry into the war, approached various American aircraft manufacturers seeking additional production capacity. One option under consideration was the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a capable if unspectacular fighter already in production. The British approached North American Aviation, a relatively young company based in California, with a proposal. Would they build P-40s under license to help meet British needs? The answer they received was unexpected. James H. Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president, made a counterproposal that must have seemed audacious, perhaps even foolhardy. Instead of building someone else's fighter design, North American would design and build an entirely new, superior fighter from scratch. Even more remarkably, they promised to have a prototype ready in just 120 days, a timeline that seemed impossible given the complexity of designing a modern fighter aircraft. The British, desperate for aircraft and intrigued by the confidence of this American company, agreed, but only if North American could truly deliver on that aggressive timeline. What followed was one of the most concentrated efforts in aviation design history. A team led by chief designer Edgar Schmid worked at a feverish pace, incorporating the latest aerodynamic research and design innovations. They studied the captured data from a Messerschmitt Bf 109, learning lessons about high-performance fighter design from Germany's frontline fighter. They designed the aircraft around the Allison V1710 engine, the most powerful American inline engine available. They paid obsessive attention to reducing drag. Every line of the aircraft was refined for aerodynamic efficiency, resulting in a fighter that looked fast even sitting on the ground. 117 days later, 3 days ahead of the promised deadline, the prototype rolled out. Designated NA-73X by the company, it first flew on October 26, 1940, piloted by test pilot Vance Breeze. Despite a minor accident during that first flight when Breeze was forced to make an emergency landing due to fuel system issues, the aircraft's performance immediately impressed. It was fast, reaching speeds over 380 miles per hour. It had excellent range thanks to an innovative laminar flow wing design that reduced drag and allowed space for substantial internal fuel tanks. The cockpit visibility was superb, with a bubble canopy giving the pilot nearly 360-degree vision. The British were sufficiently impressed to place orders, christening the aircraft the Mustang, following their tradition of naming American-built aircraft after American themes. The Mustang Mk-I entered Royal Air Force service in 1942 as a low-altitude fighter-bomber and tactical reconnaissance aircraft. In these roles, operating below 10,000 feet, the Mustang performed admirably. Pilots praised its handling characteristics, its speed, its range, and its overall flying qualities. But there was a problem, a significant problem that limited the Mustang's potential. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison V1710 engine's performance fell off dramatically. The single-stage, single-speed supercharger simply could not compress enough air to maintain power at high altitude. This meant the Mustang, despite all its other excellent qualities, could not effectively operate in the high-altitude realm where the bomber war was being fought. American bomber formations typically flew at 25,000 feet or higher, altitudes where the Allison-powered Mustang struggled and where Luftwaffe fighters operated with deadly efficiency. For many aircraft, this would have been the end of the story. A promising design hamstrung by an inadequate power plant, relegated to secondary roles while other fighters took the spotlight. The P-40, powered by the same Allison engine, faced identical high-altitude limitations. The P-38 Lightning, which used turbocharged versions of the Allison, could reach high altitudes but suffered from a litany of mechanical problems in the extreme cold of high-altitude European operations. But the Mustang's story took a different turn, thanks to a test pilot's keen eye and persistent advocacy. April 30, 1942. At Duxford Aerodrome in England, a Rolls-Royce service liaison pilot named Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit of Mustang MK-I AG-422 for a 30-minute evaluation flight. Harker was no ordinary test pilot. He had joined Rolls-Royce in 1934 and had extensive experience testing aircraft equipped with various Rolls-Royce engines, including the Kestrel and the Merlin. As he put the Mustang through its paces, Harker immediately recognized what he was flying. The airframe was exceptional, the handling was crisp and responsive, the visibility was excellent, the aerodynamics were clearly advanced. But climbing through 15,000 feet, he felt the Allison engine begin to lose its edge, the performance tapering off just as combat demands would be increasing. Harker landed with his mind already working on a solution. He knew the Allison's limitations intimately. He also knew the capabilities of Rolls-Royce's Merlin engine, particularly the latest 60 series versions with their two-stage, two-speed superchargers that maintained excellent power output at high altitude. These were the engines going into the latest marks of Spitfires, enabling them to fight effectively at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The question forming in Harker's mind was simple but profound. What would happen if you mated the Mustang's superb airframe with the Merlin's high-altitude capability? Back at Rolls-Royce, Harker immediately began advocating for the idea. The initial response was resistance. Rolls-Royce was already stretched to capacity trying to meet production demands for Merlins for Spitfires, Hurricanes, Lancasters, and other aircraft. The Air Ministry in London was similarly skeptical. Why divert precious resources to experiment with an American fighter when British Spitfires were already performing well? But Harker was persistent, making his case to anyone who would listen. He found an ally in Sir Wilfred Freeman, the Air Member for Production and Research at the Air Ministry, and gradually convinced the skeptics to allow a small-scale trial. The project that would transform the Mustang began in mid-1942. At Hucknall, Rolls-Royce engineers began the process of installing a Merlin 61 engine into a Mustang MK-I airframe. This was no simple swap. The Merlin was more than 350 pounds heavier than the Allison, requiring careful attention to the aircraft's center of gravity. The engine mounts had to be redesigned. The cooling system had to be modified to handle the Merlin's different requirements. A 4-bladed propeller replaced the Allison version's 3 blades. The intercooler for the Merlin's 2-stage supercharger required additional plumbing and ducting. Dozens of engineering challenges had to be solved. October 1942. At Hucknall, the aircraft Rolls-Royce designated as the Mustang X, the X denoting its experimental status, was ready for flight testing. When it took to the air, the transformation was immediately apparent. At altitude, the Merlin Mustang was a revelation. Where the Allison-powered version had wheezed and struggled above 15,000 feet, the Merlin Mustang pulled strongly through 20,000, 25,000, 30,000 feet and beyond. The top speed increased dramatically. Calculations suggested speeds above 440 miles per hour at high altitude were achievable. The service ceiling jumped to over 40,000 feet. The Mustang had gone from being a capable low-altitude fighter to being one of the highest-performing fighters at any altitude. Word of the Mustang X's performance crossed the Atlantic rapidly. In the United States, North American Aviation had already been considering the Merlin option, and Packard Motor Car Company had already begun producing Merlin engines under license in America, designated the V1650. The collaboration between Britain and America was vital. British factories were being bombed regularly, and American mass production capacity could produce Merlins in quantities that Rolls-Royce alone could not match. Between 1942 and 1945, Packard would produce over 55,000 Merlin engines using American mass production techniques. In August 1942, even before the first flight tests of the Mustang X were complete, the United States Army Air Forces placed an order for 400 Merlin-powered Mustangs, designated XP-51B. The USAAF had become convinced based on the promising calculations and reports from England that this aircraft could be the solution to their desperate need for a long-range, high-altitude escort fighter. The first American Merlin Mustang, the XP-51B, flew in November 1942. Production of the P-51B began at North American's Inglewood, California plant in June 1943. But engineers were still refining the design, still pushing to extract every ounce of capability from the airframe. In July 1943, The Army Air Forces directed all fighter manufacturers to maximize internal fuel capacity. Range was now the paramount concern. North Americans engineers calculated that the P-51B's center of gravity could accommodate an additional 85-gallon fuel tank installed behind the pilot. This fuselage tank, incorporated into the P-51B-10 production variant and retrofitted to earlier P-51Bs, dramatically increased the Mustang's range. Combined with external drop tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat was joined, the P-51B could now fly escort missions deep into Germany, to Berlin and back. The numbers told the story of the Mustang's transformation into the ultimate escort fighter. With internal fuel only, the P-51B had a range of about 950 miles. Add 275-gallon drop tanks, and the range extended to approximately 1,300 miles. Install 208-gallon drop tanks, and the Mustang could fly nearly 2,000 miles, enough to escort bombers from England to targets anywhere in Germany, to Prague, to Vienna, and return. No other fighter in production in 1943 could match this combination of range, high-altitude performance, and combat capability. But range and performance on paper meant nothing if the aircraft couldn't arrive in sufficient numbers and couldn't prove itself in combat. Through the summer and fall of 1943, P-51Bs began arriving in England in growing numbers. The first fighter groups converted to the type, pilots transitioning from P-47 Thunderbolts or P-38 Lightnings to the sleek new Mustangs. The learning curve was steep. The Mustang flew differently than other American fighters, lighter on the controls, more responsive, demanding more finesse. But pilots quickly came to appreciate the aircraft. The visibility from the cockpit was superb. The handling was crisp and predictable. And most importantly, when you pushed the throttle forward at 25,000 feet, the Merlin engine pulled strongly, accelerating the Mustang to speeds that could catch or outrun any Luftwaffe fighter. December 1943 marked the Mustang's combat debut in the escort role over Germany. Those first missions where the Luftwaffe encountered a new opponent that didn't turn back at the German border. Initial encounters were tentative. The Luftwaffe had grown accustomed to the patterns of American fighter operations, knew where the P-47s and P-38s had to turn back, knew they could concentrate their attacks on the bombers once the escorts departed. The appearance of unfamiliar fighters deep over Germany disrupted those patterns. Combat reports began filtering back through Luftwaffe intelligence channels describing fast, maneuverable single-engine fighters escorting bombers to targets that had previously been beyond escort range. January 1944. The 8th Air Force continued building its strength, more P-51 groups becoming operational, tactics being refined. The Mustang's combat record began to accumulate. In dogfights with Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, the Mustang proved more than competitive. The lighter armament of the P-51, 6.50 caliber machine guns compared to the mixed cannon and machine gun armament of German fighters, was tuned specifically for air-to-air combat. The Mustang could outturn the FW-190 at high altitude and could outrun the Bf-109 in level flight. The two-stage supercharged Merlin gave the Mustang superior high-altitude performance compared to the Luftwaffe fighters, which were increasingly being pressed into service loaded with heavy cannon and rockets for attacking bombers, armament that degraded their fighter-versus-fighter performance. But the Mustang would prove its worth most dramatically in late February 1944, during a week of maximum effort operations that would be remembered as Big Week. The goal was to strike a devastating blow against German aircraft production facilities, to destroy the factories building Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, to crater the airfields, to force the Luftwaffe into battle and bleed it white in a decisive air battle. Every available bomber and fighter would be committed. The Mustang would face its first major test. February 20th, 1944. The weather, which had grounded operations for weeks, finally cleared. At dawn, over 1,000 American heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, lifted off from airfields across eastern England, bound for aircraft factories in central Germany. Accompanying them were over 800 escort fighters, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs. The force represented the largest concentration of American air power yet assembled in Europe. German radar detected the formations building over England and correctly assessed that a major attack was developing. Luftwaffe fighter groups across Germany scrambled to intercept. The bomber stream stretched for miles across the sky, a river of metal and men flowing eastward. The escort plan was carefully layered. P-38s and P-47s would provide coverage for the initial penetration and during the climb to altitude, their shorter range limiting them to the outer portions of the mission. The P-51s, with their extended range, would escort the bombers all the way to the targets deep in Germany and back to the coast. This distribution of forces was new. Previous operations had seen all escort fighters withdraw together, leaving the bombers naked for the deepest portion of the mission. Now, for the first time, continuous fighter cover would be maintained throughout the entire mission profile. The Luftwaffe rose to meet the threat in strength. Over 300 German fighters engaged the American formations throughout the day. The air battles were fierce and chaotic, contrails marking twisting dogfights at high altitude, bombers pressing on through flak and fighter attacks, gunners firing at targets that flashed past in seconds. In one sector, a formation of twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighters, aircraft equipped with heavy cannon and rockets for bomber killing, attempted to press an attack. They were bounced by P-51s before they could launch their weapons. The Bf 110s, effective against bombers but helpless in air-to-air combat with single-engine fighters, were slaughtered. Within minutes, several were falling in flames, the rest scattering in survival turns. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 as that tried to intercept found themselves at a disadvantage at altitude, where the Mustang's Merlin engine gave superior performance. Bf 109s fared better, their performance more comparable to the Mustang, but even they were handicapped. Many had been loaded with additional cannon and armor for bomber destruction, weight that reduced their effectiveness in fighter combat. The day's operations cost the 8th Air Force 21 bombers, serious losses, but dramatically lower than the 1 in 4 loss rates of the previous autumn. The Luftwaffe losses were proportionally much higher. Escort fighters claimed over 60 German fighters destroyed in air combat. The P-51s, despite flying fewer sorties than the more numerous P-47s, accounted for a disproportionate number of kills. February 21, 1944. The bombers returned to German skies, again with massive fighter escort. Again the Luftwaffe rose to defend. Again the air battles raged across hundreds of miles. The pattern was being established. The presence of long-range escorts meant the bombers were never vulnerable, never undefended. Luftwaffe fighters that attempted to attack the bomber formations found themselves engaged by American fighters immediately. The tactical equation had shifted fundamentally. Over the next 4 days, the offensive continued. February 22nd, 23rd, 24th, missions were flown to aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, airframe assembly facilities. On February 25th, nearly 600 Royal Air Force bombers struck Augsburg at night, adding British heavy bombers to the week's devastation. By the time Big Week concluded, the 8th Air Force had flown nearly 4,000 heavy bomber sorties and dropped more than 20 million pounds of bombs on German industrial targets. The fighter escorts had flown thousands of sorties, engaged hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters, and established a combat record that shook the German fighter arm to its core. The statistics from Big Week told a story of transformation. During the operations, P-51 Mustangs flew roughly 1/5 the number of sorties as P-47 Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt was still the most numerous fighter type in the 8th Air Force. But the Mustangs claimed 64.5 kills, compared to 78 for the Thunderbolts, nearly equal numbers despite the massive disparity in sorties flown. The kill-per-sortie ratio for the Mustang was exceptional, reflecting both the aircraft's performance and increasingly also the skill of pilots who were learning to exploit the Mustang's capabilities. But the numbers that mattered most were the bomber losses. Luftwaffe fighter effectiveness had been significantly degraded. German fighter losses during Big Week exceeded 30%, a rate they could not sustain. The 8th Air Force bomber losses had fallen below 10%. Still painful, still significant, but sustainable. The combined bomber offensive, which had seemed on the verge of collapse just 4 months earlier, was back on track. The Mustang had provided the missing piece. March 1944. The 8th Air Force conducted its first large-scale raid on Berlin, the German capital. 69 bombers were lost, but 662 returned. A success rate that would have been impossible without long-range escort. P-51s escorted the bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Americans, it demonstrated that no target in Germany was beyond reach. For the Luftwaffe and for the German leadership, the sight of American fighters over Berlin in daylight represented a turning point. The shield that had protected German skies was broken. Through the spring of 1944, the transformation accelerated. The 8th Air Force began systematically converting its fighter groups from P-47s and P-38s to P-51s. The Mustang's superiority in the escort role was undeniable. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups would be equipped with Mustangs. The 357th Fighter Group, one of the most successful units, would be officially credited with destroying 595.5 enemy aircraft over the course of the war flying P-51s, a testament to the aircraft's combat effectiveness. Fighter tactics evolved to exploit the Mustang's capabilities more fully. In the early days of bomber escort, fighters had been restricted to flying close formation with the bombers, weaving above them in a fuel-intensive protective pattern. Doctrine held that the fighter's sole mission was bomber protection. They were not to leave the bombers to pursue enemy fighters. This defensive posture had limited effectiveness. In early 1944, escort doctrine changed dramatically. Fighter groups were given the freedom to engage enemy fighters aggressively, to pursue Luftwaffe aircraft, to hunt. The Mustangs began ranging ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping German airspace, engaging Luftwaffe fighters before they could form up for attacks on the bombers. This offensive posture had multiple benefits. It disrupted German defensive plans, it forced the Luftwaffe to fight on American terms, and paradoxically, it improved bomber protection by destroying the threat before it could reach the bomber formations. The Mustangs also began to execute a tactic that would prove devastating to the Luftwaffe: strafing attacks on German airfields. Fighter groups returning from escort missions, with fuel remaining and no longer tied to bomber formations, would descend to low altitude and attack Luftwaffe airfields, catching German fighters on the ground during landing, refueling, or takeoff. These attacks had begun in late February 1944 and intensified through the spring. The goal was to achieve air supremacy over Europe in preparation for the coming invasion of France. German fighters destroyed on the ground couldn't intercept bombers. Damaged runways meant fewer sorties. Strafing attacks on locomotives and rail infrastructure meant reduced mobility for German forces. The Mustang groups became strategic weapons in their own right, not merely escorts but offensive implements actively hunting and destroying German air power wherever it could be found. The numbers continued to accumulate through the spring and summer of 1944. On individual missions, P-51 pilots racked up impressive scores. On April 11, 1944, when the 8th Air Force attacked aviation industry targets in Saxony-Anhalt and 64 bombers were shot down in fierce fighting, the 364th Fighter Squadron of the 357th Fighter Group was credited with 23 of the 51 aerial victories scored that day. Another 22 victories were credited on April 24 during operations against Bavarian targets. These numbers reflected the Mustang's dominance. The aircraft gave skilled pilots a decisive advantage in combat. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They developed new tactics, attempting to avoid combat with the Mustang escorts and focus exclusively on the bombers. They concentrated their forces, attempting to achieve local numerical superiority that could overwhelm fighter screens. They deployed new weapons, large-caliber cannon, air-to-air rockets, even a few Mi-163 rocket-powered interceptors. None of it was enough. The fundamental problem remained: the Luftwaffe had to operate over their own territory, taking off from fields that were known to American intelligence, assembling at altitudes where they were visible to American formations, and ultimately having to close with the bombers to engage them, at which point the escorts engaged. The Mustang pilots, meanwhile, could choose when and where to fight, could use their speed and altitude performance to dictate combat terms, and had sufficient fuel to pursue enemies and still escort the bombers home. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Mustangs flew overhead, providing air cover, strafing German positions, interdicting German reinforcements. The air supremacy that made the Normandy invasion possible had been won in the preceding months by the strategic bombing campaign and the air battles over Germany, battles in which the P-51 had been instrumental. In the days and weeks following D-Day, Mustangs continued to dominate the skies over France, supporting ground operations, attacking German airfields, and maintaining the air superiority that allowed Allied ground forces to advance with minimal interference from the Luftwaffe. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the toll on the Luftwaffe became unsustainable. Experienced German pilots were being killed or captured at a rate that training programs couldn't replace. Aircraft production, despite Herculean efforts to disperse factories and maintain output in the face of strategic bombing, couldn't keep pace with losses. Fuel shortages, as Allied forces captured or destroyed German fuel production and storage facilities, meant that even aircraft that were available often couldn't fly. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in the early war years, which had seemed invincible over Poland and France and the Balkans, was being bled to death in the skies over Germany. By late 1944, the air superiority situation had completely reversed. American bomber formations flew over Germany in daylight with relative impunity. Fighter escorts outnumbered defending fighters. Luftwaffe opposition became sporadic, then rare. On some missions, bomber formations encountered no aerial opposition at all, a situation unthinkable just a year earlier. The Mustangs ranged far and wide across German airspace, hunting for targets of opportunity, strafing anything that moved. The combat ratio had become lopsided. In some engagements, 10 German fighters were lost for every American aircraft shot down. There were still moments of desperate fury. In April 1945, as the Third Reich entered its death throes, the Luftwaffe launched a final, desperate operation. Sonderkommando Elba was formed, volunteer pilots, many of them young and barely trained, flying stripped-down Bf-109s with minimal fuel and armament. Their mission was to ram American bombers, to trade their lives for bomber kills in last-ditch defense of the homeland. Over 150 aircraft took off. The Mustangs fell upon them. The ramming attack achieved minimal success. Perhaps 8 bombers were destroyed by ramming. The cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. Nearly all the Sonderkommando Elba aircraft were shot down, most by Mustangs. In a single day, the Luftwaffe lost 300 fighters. A week later, another 700 German aircraft were destroyed. These losses, coming at a time when German resources were already exhausted, represented the final collapse of German air power. The P-51 Mustang's combat record by war's end was extraordinary. Over 15,000 Mustangs were produced during the war years. They served in every theater: Europe, the Mediterranean, the Pacific. They equipped American fighter groups, RAF squadrons, and other Allied air forces. In the Pacific, the Mustang's range made it invaluable, escorting B-29 Superfortress bombers on their long missions from island bases to targets in Japan. In Europe, where the Mustang's impact was most decisive, P-51 pilots were credited with destroying nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in air combat, more than any other Allied fighter type in that theater. Hundreds more German aircraft were destroyed on the ground by Mustang strafing attacks. Individual pilots achieved remarkable records flying Mustangs. Many of the highest-scoring American aces of the European theater flew P-51s. The aircraft's combination of performance, range, and reliability made it an ideal platform for aggressive pilots who could exploit its capabilities. Stories accumulated of Mustang pilots deep in German territory, alone or in small formations, engaging superior numbers of enemy fighters and emerging victorious. But beyond the individual combat records, beyond the kill ratios and sortie statistics, the Mustang's true impact lay in what it enabled. The strategic bombing campaign that the P-51 made viable contributed directly to Germany's defeat. The destruction of German industrial capacity, the disruption of transportation networks, the diversion of resources to air defense, all of these effects weakened Germany's ability to wage war. The air supremacy achieved over Europe made the D-Day invasion possible and supported the advance of Allied armies across France and into Germany. The morale effect on both sides was significant. American bomber crews gained confidence knowing they had protection all the way to and from the target, while German defenders grew demoralized by the seemingly endless waves of bombers and fighters that filled their skies. The technical achievement represented by the P-51 was remarkable. The original North American design had been excellent: the laminar flow wing, the aerodynamic refinement, the attention to drag reduction. But it was the marriage of that American airframe with the British Merlin engine that created the exceptional aircraft. The story of the Mustang was fundamentally a story of Allied cooperation, of British desperation leading to American design innovation, of a British test pilot recognizing potential and a British engine providing the missing capability, of American mass production making the aircraft available in war-winning numbers. Neither nation alone could have produced the Mustang at the right time and in sufficient quantity. Together, they created one of the most significant weapons of the war. The Merlin engine itself deserves recognition. Designed by Rolls-Royce starting in 1933, building on experience with liquid-cooled high-performance engines developed in the 1920s and 1930s, the Merlin powered many of the most significant Allied aircraft of the war: the Hurricane, the Spitfire, the Lancaster bomber, and ultimately the Mustang. The two-stage, two-speed supercharged versions that gave the P-51B and later variants their high-altitude performance represented the pinnacle of piston engine development. The most powerful versions of the Merlin developed more horsepower per displacement than any other production engine of World War II. The collaboration between Rolls-Royce and Packard Motor Car Company, which produced over 55,000 Merlins in America under license, demonstrated the power of Allied industrial cooperation. The P-51D variant, introduced in mid-1944, represented a further refinement of the design. The most visible change was the bubble canopy, replacing the earlier Razorback design and providing even better visibility. The D model also featured 6.50 caliber machine guns with increased ammunition capacity and improved sighting systems. The P-51D became the most numerous variant, with over 8,000 produced. It was P-51DS that equipped most fighter groups in the final year of the war in Europe. The ultimate development, the P-51H, was a lightened version with even better performance, but it arrived too late to see significant combat in World War II. After the war, the Mustang's service continued. In the Korean War, P-51s, redesignated F-51s under a new system, served as ground attack aircraft, their long range and heavy armament making them effective for close air support missions. The Mustang remained in service with various air forces around the world into the 1980s, a testament to the soundness of the basic design. Today, warbirds enthusiasts treasure surviving P-51s, and the aircraft remains one of the most recognized and celebrated fighters of World War II. The counterfactual question is worth considering. What if the Mustang had not been developed, or had been delayed, or had not received the Merlin engine? The strategic bombing campaign in 1943 was on the verge of collapse. Without a solution to the Escort fighter problem, deep penetration missions would have remained prohibitively costly. The combined bomber offensive might have been abandoned or drastically scaled back. The impact on the overall war effort is difficult to calculate precisely, but certainly significant. Would D-Day have been possible without the air supremacy that the strategic bombing campaign helped achieve? Would Germany have been able to produce more weapons, more aircraft, more tanks if their industry hadn't been bombed? Would the war have lasted longer, cost more lives? These questions suggest the profound strategic importance of what might seem a purely tactical solution, a better fighter aircraft. The Mustang represented a convergence of many factors at exactly the right time. The crisis of late 1943 created urgent demand. The design work of 1940 and 1941 created a superb airframe. The insight of a test pilot in 1942 created the concept of the Merlin Mustang. The engineering work of late 1942 and early 1943 made it reality. The industrial capacity of America and Britain produced it in sufficient numbers. The tactical innovation of early 1944 employed it effectively. The courage of pilots flying long missions deep into hostile territory made it decisive. Remove any one of these factors and the story changes. In the history of military aviation, certain aircraft stand out not merely for their technical specifications but for their impact on the course of events. The P-51 Mustang belongs in that select group. It was the right aircraft at the right moment, solving a critical problem that threatened an entire strategic campaign. British vision and desperation, American design and production capability, Anglo-American cooperation and mutual respect, all came together in a single airframe powered by a British engine, creating a weapon that helped win the air war over Europe and contributed materially to Allied victory in World War II. On that December morning in 1943, when the first P-51BS escorted bombers to Emden and back, few could have predicted the scale of the transformation that was beginning. Within months, the Mustang would dominate the skies over Germany. Within a year, the Luftwaffe would be a spent force. Within 18 months, the war in Europe would be over. The sleek fighter with the distinctive profile, born of unlikely circumstances and forged through international cooperation, had changed the calculus of air warfare. The bomber offensive that had seemed doomed was saved. The air supremacy that enabled Allied victory was achieved. And the P-51 Mustang earned its place in history as one of the most important and effective fighter aircraft ever built. The war winner that almost wasn't the product of British vision and American execution, the marriage of Allied technology that proved greater than the sum of its parts.